Do you remember Aristotle Onassis? For decades, he was one of the richest and most talked about men on the planet. But the two women who actually married him lived lives tangled with tragedy that still leave people asking questions decades later. One became one of the most photographed women alive. The other met an end so sudden and so eerily similar to a tragedy that had already struck her own family that people still bring it up today. Stick around, because both of their stories are far more complicated than the headlines ever let on. The man who built an empire from nothing. Before either marriage, before the fame and before the fortune, Aristotle Onassis was simply a teenager fleeing for his life. He was born on January 20th, 1906, in Smyrna, a bustling port city, then part of the Ottoman Empire, now known as Izmir in modern Turkey. His family belonged to the prosperous Greek merchant community that had lived in the city for generations, and by most accounts, Aristotle grew up surrounded by relative comfort and opportunity, attending good schools and absorbing the multicultural, commercially minded atmosphere of one of the Eastern Mediterranean's great trading ports. In 1922, catastrophe struck the city in the form of a devastating fire that destroyed much of Smyrna amid a brutal military conflict, forcing the Onassis family, along with hundreds of thousands of other Greeks, to flee for their lives. Aristotle escaped with very little, and by 1923, still just a teenager, he had made his way to Argentina, arriving with barely any money and an enormous amount of ambition. It was a jarring transition, from a life of relative privilege in one of the world's great cosmopolitan port cities to the uncertainty of starting over entirely from scratch in an unfamiliar country on the other side of the world. In Buenos Aires, he built his first fortune trading tobacco, working relentlessly and reinvesting nearly everything he earned. He learned Spanish quickly, built relationships throughout the local business community, and by his early 20s had already accumulated a level of wealth that would have seemed unimaginable just a few years earlier, when he had arrived in the country as a penniless refugee. By the 1930s, he had turned his attention towards shipping, purchasing his first freighters during the depths of the Great Depression, when vessels could be bought at rock-bottom prices from desperate sellers. It was a bold and, at the time, deeply unconventional gamble, but it laid the foundation for what would eventually become one of the largest privately owned shipping fleets in the entire world. By the time the Second World War ended, Onassis had positioned himself at the center of the global shipping industry, having weathered the wartime disruptions that sank or grounded so many of his competitors' fleets, and he was ready to make his next major move, one that would connect him permanently to one of the most powerful shipping families in Greece. A marriage that united two empires. In 1946, Onassis married Athena Mary Livanos, known to nearly everyone in her life simply as Tina. She was the daughter of Stavros Livanos, one of the most powerful and wealthy shipping magnates in Greece, and the marriage instantly connected two of the largest shipping fortunes in the country. Tina had been born in Kensington, London, on March 19th, 1929, into a life defined from the very beginning by extraordinary wealth, private schools, and constant movement between the glamorous capitals of Europe and the United States. When she married Onassis, she was just 17 years old, while he was already 40, a striking age gap that raised eyebrows even within the notoriously wealthy and unconventional shipping world they both belonged to. Tina had grown up in a world almost entirely shaped by her father's business empire, moving between homes in London, New York, and various parts of Europe, surrounded by a level of privilege that few people outside her immediate social circle could ever fully comprehend. She had an older sister, Eugenia, who would herself go on to marry into the shipping world in a way that would eventually tie the Livanos family even more tightly into the complicated web of relationships that came to define this entire story. Their brother, George, would later carry on the family's shipping business, keeping the Livanos name at the center of the Greek maritime world for decades to come. From a young age, Tina understood implicitly that marriage within her world often carried as much business significance as it did personal or romantic meaning, a reality that would shape nearly every major relationship decision she made throughout her adult life. The wedding took place on December 28th, 1946, in New York City, and it was, from the very beginning, as much a business alliance as it was a romance, uniting the Livanos and Onassis shipping dynasties in a way that made both families even more formidable within their fiercely competitive industry. In the years that followed, Onassis, Tina's father, and a third major shipping figure named Stavros Niarchos, who would later marry Tina's older sister, formed what many considered the most powerful shipping alliance in the world, three interconnected families controlling an enormous share of global maritime trade. It's a detail that would come back around in an almost unbelievable way decades later, tying these same families together through tragedy after tragedy. Tina and Onassis settled into a life split between New York and Europe, and the couple went on to have two children together, a son named Alexander, born in 1948, and a daughter named Christina, born in 1950. For a while, at least on the surface, their marriage represented exactly the kind of glamorous, powerful partnership that Greek shipping society expected and celebrated, with the young couple hosting lavish gatherings and moving comfortably through the highest circles of European and American high society, their names appearing regularly in the society pages alongside the era's other great fortunes. But beneath the surface, cracks were already beginning to form, cracks that would eventually be blown wide open by one of the most famous love affairs of the 20th century. The affair that ended the first marriage. In 1957, Onassis met the woman who would become one of the most consequential figures in his entire personal life, the celebrated opera singer Maria Callas. At the time, both Onassis and Callas were married to other people, and their initial meeting at a party in Venice gave little hint of what was to come. Callas was, by that point, already one of the most famous performers in the world, celebrated for her extraordinary vocal talent and her commanding stage presence. And by many accounts, Onassis found himself instantly captivated by her in a way he had rarely experienced with anyone else in his life. 2 years later, in the summer of 1959, Onassis invited Callas and her husband aboard his enormous private yacht, the Christina, for a cruise through the Mediterranean. And it was during that voyage that their relationship shifted from friendship into something far more serious. The cruise brought together an extraordinary collection of guests, including Winston Churchill, and it became, in retrospect, one of the defining moments of both Onassis's and Callas's personal lives, the beginning of an affair that would continue in various forms for the rest of their time together. The affair became increasingly difficult to keep private, and Tina, who had spent over a decade building a life and a family alongside Onassis, eventually discovered what was happening. Devastated and humiliated by the public nature of her husband's infidelity, Tina made the decision to end the marriage, and the couple officially divorced in 1960. It marked the end of a 14-year partnership that had once symbolized the merging of two of the most powerful shipping dynasties in the world, and it sent Tina, still only in her early 30s, into an entirely new chapter of her life, one that would eventually intertwine her fate with the very shipping families she had grown up among. For a woman who had spent her entire adult life inside a marriage built as much on business alliance as personal affection, the public humiliation of the affair reportedly cut especially deep. adding a layer of personal heartbreak to what had already been, in many ways, a fairly formal and transactional union from the very beginning. Meanwhile, Onassis's relationship with Callas continued for years afterward, becoming one of the most talked about romances of its era, a pairing between one of the world's wealthiest men and one of the most celebrated performers on earth. According to people who worked closely with Onassis over the years, the connection between the two of them never fully faded, even long after other relationships entered both of their lives. A bond that seemed to exist somewhat apart from the more conventional marriages and partnerships either of them pursued in the years that followed. But even that relationship, as passionate and enduring as it seemed to outside observers, would not ultimately be the one that defined the next major chapter of Onassis's life. That distinction would belong to a woman who, at the time of his divorce from Tina, was still known to the world as the First Lady of the United States. The woman who would become Jackie O. Long before their names were ever linked romantically in the press, Aristotle Onassis and Jacqueline Bouvier Kennedy had already crossed paths repeatedly through the overlapping social circles of the wealthy and powerful. Jacqueline, born on July 28, 1929, in Southampton, New York, had married then-Senator John F. Kennedy in 1953 and became one of the most admired and closely watched First Ladies in American history following his election to the presidency in 1960. Her sense of style, poise, and cultural sophistication captivated the country throughout the early 1960s, transforming her into an international icon well before tragedy ever touched her life. During her time in the White House, she led a major effort to restore its historic rooms with authentic period furnishings and artwork, a project that reflected both her genuine passion for history and her instinct for careful, deliberate public presentation, qualities that would remain constant throughout the rest of her extraordinary life. In the fall of 1963, Jacqueline experienced a devastating personal loss when her newborn son, Patrick, died just days after being born prematurely. Onassis, who had already developed a friendship with the Kennedys through mutual social connections, offered comfort and support to Jacqueline during this incredibly difficult period, even inviting her aboard his yacht for a private cruise meant to help her recover from her grief. It was, in many ways, the first meaningful moment of closeness between the two of them, a gesture of genuine kindness during an especially painful chapter of her life, long before anyone could have anticipated where that friendship would eventually lead. Just months later, in November of 1963, President Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, Texas, thrusting Jacqueline into a period of national mourning unlike almost anything the country had ever experienced, with the entire world watching her navigate unimaginable grief with remarkable public composure. The images of her at her husband's funeral, standing beside her two young children, Caroline and John Jr., became some of the most enduring and widely remembered photographs of the entire decade, cementing her place in the American public imagination as a figure of extraordinary dignity in the face of tragedy. In the years that followed, Onassis remained a steady and increasingly important presence in Jacqueline's life, offering her the kind of privacy, security, and protection that she found almost impossible to find anywhere else, given the relentless public attention that followed her everywhere she went. Their friendship gradually deepened over the following years, even as Onassis continued his long relationship with Maria Callas, and even as members of the Kennedy family expressed serious reservations about the growing closeness between the widowed former First Lady and the much older, famously unconventional shipping magnate. Robert Kennedy, in particular, reportedly held deep concerns about the relationship, worried about how a connection to such a controversial and politically complicated figure might affect the Kennedy family's public standing during a period when he himself was preparing for his own run at the presidency. A wedding that shocked the world, On October 20th, 1968, Jacqueline Kennedy married Aristotle Onassis in a private ceremony on Skorpios, Onassis's own privately owned island in the Ionian Sea off the coast of Greece. The wedding sent shockwaves through American society and around the world, transforming the widow of a beloved assassinated president into the wife of a controversial 23 years older foreign businessman almost overnight. Many Americans reacted with genuine dismay, feeling as though the marriage somehow tarnished the memory of President Kennedy, while others were simply fascinated by the sheer scale of wealth and mystery surrounding her new husband. The wedding itself took place under heavy security and secrecy, with the small island fiercely guarded against the swarm of international journalists desperate for any glimpse of the ceremony. Jacqueline wore a cream-colored dress rather than a traditional white wedding gown, a detail that fueled endless commentary in the press at the time, and the small guest list included members of both the Kennedy and Onassis families, though notably fewer high-profile political figures than might have attended a wedding earlier in her life. The sheer scale of interest surrounding the event reflected just how much fascination still surrounded Jacqueline nearly 5 years after her husband's assassination, with newspapers and magazines around the world dedicating extensive coverage to every possible detail of the ceremony and the life she was about to begin. The marriage also raised uncomfortable questions within religious circles, since Onassis had been divorced and his first wife, Tina, was still very much alive at the time of the wedding, leading to speculation that Jacqueline might face consequences within the Catholic Church. Those concerns were eventually dismissed by church officials, but the controversy surrounding the marriage never fully faded, and Jacqueline quickly found herself the target of relentless media attention, earning the now famous nickname Jackie O, a moniker that would follow her for the rest of her life. Paparazzi hounded her constantly, and a now legendary photographer became so aggressive in pursuing photographs of her that Jacqueline was eventually granted a restraining order against him, a testament to just how invasive the public fascination with her new life had become. Behind the scenes, the marriage proved to be far more complicated than the fairy tale image the public initially imagined. Onassis's relationship with Maria Callas reportedly never fully ended, even after his wedding to Jacqueline, with the two continuing to see each other privately, according to people close to Onassis's household staff at the time. Jacqueline, by most accounts, was aware of the ongoing connection, but chose to focus on maintaining her own independence and privacy rather than confronting the situation directly, splitting her time between homes in Greece, Paris, and New York, where her two children from her first marriage continued attending school. Before the wedding, Onassis had also insisted on a carefully negotiated prenuptial agreement, a document that reportedly took considerable time and legal maneuvering to finalize, reflecting just how much both parties approached the marriage with a clear-eyed awareness of its practical and financial dimensions, alongside whatever genuine affection existed between them. It was, in many ways, a marriage built more on mutual practicality, protection, and companionship than traditional romantic passion, and it would soon be tested by tragedies that neither Onassis nor his new wife could have ever anticipated. The first signs of tragedy. While Onassis navigated his new marriage to Jacqueline, his first wife, Tina, had been building her own new life in the years following their divorce. In 1961, she married John Spencer Churchill, known as Sonny, who would later become the 11th Duke of Marlborough, elevating Tina into the ranks of British aristocracy and giving her the title of Marchioness of Blandford. It was a marriage that placed Tina at the centre of one of Britain's most storied aristocratic families, connecting her, at least by marriage, to the same lineage that had once produced Winston Churchill himself. That marriage lasted nearly a decade before ending in divorce in 1971, closing out yet another chapter in Tina's own eventful romantic history. Throughout these years, Tina remained a fixture of international high society, moving between homes in England, France, and elsewhere in Europe, maintaining her connections to both the Livanos and, indirectly, the Onassis families, even as her own personal life continued to shift and evolve. She reportedly remained close to her two children throughout this period, despite the demands of her own busy social calendar, making regular efforts to see Alexander and Christina whenever her travels allowed, determined not to let the upheaval in her romantic life come at the expense of her relationship with them. Friends and acquaintances from this period often described her as elegant and warm, though those closest to her also noted a persistent undercurrent of restlessness, a sense that despite her extraordinary wealth and social standing, she remained in search of something like lasting stability that always seemed just out of reach. Later that very same year, in October of 1971, Tina made a decision that stunned nearly everyone who knew the intertwined history of these powerful shipping families. She married Stavros Niarchos, the very same shipping rival who had once formed part of the powerful three-family alliance alongside her father and her first husband decades earlier. What made the marriage even more remarkable, and to many deeply uncomfortable, was that Niarchos was the widower of Tina's own older sister, Eugenia, who had died suddenly in 1970 under circumstances that had already generated considerable speculation and concern among those close to the family. Despite the unusual and, to outside observers, unsettling nature of the match, the Livanos family reportedly gave their blessing to the union, a gesture widely interpreted at the time as publicly absolving Niarchos of any responsibility connected to Eugenia's earlier death. Tina's first husband and her own son, Alexander, both openly opposed the marriage, but Tina proceeded regardless, entering into a union that would ultimately prove to be tragically short-lived, and one that would soon be overshadowed by devastation far greater than anyone in the family could have anticipated. A devastating loss. In January of 1973, tragedy struck the Onassis family in the most painful way imaginable. Alexander Onassis, the only son of Aristotle and Tina, and the young man widely expected to eventually inherit and run his father's vast shipping empire, was involved in a catastrophic plane crash at Athens airport. He had been practicing takeoffs and landings in a small aircraft when the crash occurred, suffering severe injuries that left him in critical condition. He died a day later, on January 23rd, 1973, at just 24 years old, never having regained consciousness after the crash. The loss devastated both of his parents in ways from which neither of them, by most accounts from those close to the family, ever fully recovered. Biographers, and those close to the family, later described Aristotle and Tina in the aftermath of Alexander's death as almost unrecognizable versions of themselves, moving through the following months in a state of profound grief that touched every aspect of their lives. For Onassis, the loss of his only son and intended heir represented not just a personal tragedy, but the collapse of everything he had spent his entire life building toward, a business empire he had always envisioned passing down through his own bloodline. He reportedly became consumed with the idea that the crash had not been a simple accident, pursuing his own private investigations into the circumstances surrounding his son's death for years afterward, though nothing ever emerged to substantiate any theory beyond the official finding of an accident. For Tina, the grief compounded years of accumulated loss and disappointment, adding an almost unbearable weight to a life that had already been shaped by repeated upheaval, public scrutiny, and personal heartbreak. Alexander had been particularly close to his mother throughout his life, and by most accounts, he had also been one of the most vocal opponents of her marriage to Niarchos just a little over a year earlier, adding an especially painful layer of complexity to her grief. since the son she had lost had never fully reconciled himself to the choices she had made in the final years of his life. In the months following Alexander's death, those close to Tina described her as emotionally exhausted, someone who continued attempting to maintain her social life and her public appearances, even as she struggled privately with the depth of her grief. Friends recalled her seeming to move through these final months almost mechanically, maintaining the outward rhythms of her extraordinarily privileged life, while carrying an inner devastation that she rarely, if ever, discussed openly. It was against this backdrop of accumulated tragedy that the next chapter of Tina's story would unfold, one that would end her own life under circumstances eerily similar to the death of her own sister just a few years earlier. The mysterious death that shook two families. On October 10th, 1974, less than 2 years after losing her son, Tina Onassis Niarchos was found dead in the bedroom of the Parisian mansion she shared with her husband, Stavros Niarchos, a grand residence known as the Hôtel de Chanelay. She was just 45 years old. In the room next door, Niarchos himself had reportedly been asleep, entirely unaware of what had happened until the following morning, when the full weight of the tragedy became clear. An autopsy determined that Tina had died from pulmonary edema, a serious buildup of fluid in the lungs, which investigators concluded was closely associated with a dependency on barbiturates, a class of sedative medication that carried significant risks, particularly when combined with alcohol or taken in excessive quantities. Those who knew Tina in her final months later suggested that the accumulated weight of grief from Alexander's death, layered on top of decades of personal upheaval, had left her increasingly reliant on medication simply to manage her day-to-day life, a pattern that, tragically, mirrors patterns seen in many people struggling privately with overwhelming loss. The circumstances surrounding her death generated intense speculation at the time, given the eerie and unsettling parallel to her own sister's death just a few years earlier, since Eugenia, Niarchos's previous wife and Tina's older sister, had also died suddenly and under circumstances that were never fully or publicly clarified. The fact that both women had died in the same household, married to the same man, within a span of just a few years, was simply too striking a coincidence for the press and the public to ignore, even in the complete absence of any formal evidence pointing toward wrongdoing. The similarities between the two deaths, both wives of the same man, both members of the same family, both dying suddenly and unexpectedly years apart, fueled years of speculation and rumor within Greek shipping circles and beyond, even though no formal criminal findings were ever brought against Niarchos in connection with either death. Investigators at the time reviewed the circumstances thoroughly, and while questions lingered in the court of public opinion for years afterward, nothing ever emerged that resulted in any formal charges being filed. Tina was laid to rest at the Bois de Vaux cemetery in Lausanne, Switzerland, alongside other members of her family, closing out a life that had been defined by extraordinary wealth, repeated marriages into two of the most powerful shipping families in the world, and an accumulation of personal tragedy that few people, regardless of their fortune, could ever have been expected to withstand. Her death left Onassis, her former husband, and the father of her two children, to face the remainder of his own life burdened by an almost unbearable weight of loss. Having now buried his only son and watched the mother of his children die under such unsettling circumstances within the span of less than 2 years. For a man who had spent his entire life building an empire meant to secure his family's future for generations, the accumulated tragedy of those final years must have felt like a bitter and almost unbearable irony, wealth and power proving powerless against the kind of loss that no fortune could ever protect against. The final chapter for Onassis. The years following Alexander's death and Tina's passing took a severe toll on Aristotle Onassis's own health. He had already been diagnosed with a condition called myasthenia gravis, a chronic autoimmune disorder that causes progressive muscle weakness, and the accumulated grief and stress of these back-to-back family tragedies appeared to accelerate his physical decline considerably. Those close to him during this period described a man who seemed to have lost much of the vitality and drive that had once defined him throughout his decades of extraordinary business success. A shell of the commanding, energetic figure who had built an empire from nothing more than ambition and a handful of second-hand ships decades earlier. His eyesight, in particular, deteriorated noticeably during these final years, a condition that made it increasingly difficult for him to manage the day-to-day demands of running his sprawling shipping empire, and he was reportedly seen far less frequently in public, spending increasing amounts of time in seclusion as his health continued its steady decline. Business associates from this period described a man distracted and diminished, still nominally overseeing his shipping empire, but increasingly detached from the day-to-day energy and decisiveness that had once made him one of the most formidable businessmen in the world. Even his once legendary social life aboard the Christina slowed considerably, with fewer of the lavish gatherings and high-profile guests that had once made his yacht one of the most talked-about vessels in the world. On March 15th, 1975, Aristotle Onassis died in Neuilly-sur-Seine, near Paris, France, at the age of 69. By the time of his death, his marriage to Jacqueline had reportedly grown increasingly distant, with the two having spent significant periods of time apart in the years leading up to his passing. His will left the bulk of his enormous fortune to his surviving daughter, Christina, while Jacqueline received a settlement reported at somewhere between $20 and $26 million, a substantial sum, though notably far smaller than the vast majority of his overall estate. Onassis was laid to rest on his private island of Scorpios, alongside his son, Alexander, in a family burial ground that reflected just how much of his life, both its triumphs and its devastating losses, had unfolded on that same small piece of Greek land he had once purchased as a symbol of his extraordinary success. His death closed out one of the most remarkable and, in its final years, tragedy-marked business careers of the 20th century, leaving behind two very different women who had each shared his life, and now had to figure out how to move forward without him. Life after Onassis, for the woman. The world called Jackie O. Following Onassis's death in 1975, Jacqueline returned to New York City and, in many ways, returned to an entirely different version of herself, one focused far more on personal and professional independence than on the extraordinary wealth and public spectacle that had defined her second marriage. She began a career in book publishing, first working as a consulting editor at Viking Press, before eventually moving to Doubleday, where she rose to the position of senior editor, working on projects across a wide range of subjects that genuinely interested her, from history and biography to the arts. Colleagues from this period often described her as a genuinely dedicated and hard-working editor, someone who showed up consistently, read manuscripts thoroughly, and took real pride in helping authors shape their work. A far cry from the image some might have expected from a woman who had once been one of the most famous people in the world. Throughout the years that followed, Jacqueline also became deeply involved in historic preservation efforts in New York City, playing a notably significant role in the campaign to save Grand Central Terminal from demolition during the 1970s, a cause that reflected her long-standing appreciation for architecture and cultural heritage dating back to her earlier restoration work inside the White House. She largely avoided remarrying, instead maintaining a series of private relationships over the years, the most significant and enduring of which was with a Belgian-born businessman named Maurice Tempelsman, a diamond merchant who became her close companion and financial advisor, beginning in the years following Onassis's death. Templesman and Jacqueline's relationship grew steadily closer throughout the late 1970s and into the 1980s, eventually becoming a well-established, if famously private, partnership that lasted until the very end of her life. He helped manage and significantly grow her personal finances in the years following her inheritance from Onassis, reportedly multiplying her original settlement many times over through careful investment. The two shared a quiet, comfortable life together that included regular walks through Central Park, summers spent together at her Martha's Vineyard estate, and a small circle of close friends and family who understood and respected the private nature of their bond, including occasional visits from prominent political figures who valued both Jacqueline's continued influence and Templesman's own deep connections within Democratic Party circles. A final diagnosis. In early 1994, Jacqueline was diagnosed with a serious form of cancer affecting her lymphatic system, a diagnosis that, despite treatment, ultimately proved impossible to overcome. Even as her health declined throughout the following months, she continued to make public appearances whenever her strength allowed, including regular walks through Central Park alongside Templesman, determined to maintain as much of her normal daily life as her condition would permit. Those close to her during this period described her approach to her illness as remarkably composed and dignified, consistent with the same sense of grace and resilience that had defined her public image since the earliest days of her time as First Lady, facing this final challenge with the same quiet strength that had carried her through the assassination of her first husband, the death of her second, and decades of relentless public scrutiny in between. On May 19th, 1994, Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis died in her New York City apartment at the age of 64, with Maurice Templesman by her side in her final moments. Her funeral drew an outpouring of public grief and tribute from across the country, with mourners lining the streets outside the church where her service was held, a testament to just how deeply her story, from glamorous First Lady to grieving widow to internationally famous second wife to quietly independent career woman, had resonated with the American public across more than 3 decades in the spotlight. She was laid to rest at Arlington National Cemetery alongside President Kennedy and their 2 children who had died in infancy, closing the circle on a life that had carried her from one of the most public and scrutinized roles in American history through a second marriage that had made her one of the wealthiest and most photographed women in the world, and finally into a quieter, more private final chapter that she had worked hard to build entirely on her own terms. 2 very different endings. Looking back across both marriages, the contrast between Onassis's 2 wives becomes almost impossible to ignore. Tina Livanos, the teenage bride who had helped unite 2 of Greece's most powerful shipping dynasties, spent her adult life moving through marriage after marriage, tragedy after tragedy, ultimately dying at just 45 years old under deeply unsettling circumstances that echoed her own sister's earlier, similarly sudden death. Her life, for all its glamour and extraordinary privilege, reads in hindsight like a slow accumulation of loss, each new marriage and each fresh start ultimately unable to outrun the grief that seemed to follow her family across 3 generations of shipping dynasty rivalries. Jacqueline Kennedy, by contrast, managed to rebuild an entirely independent identity for herself after Onassis's death, stepping away from the wealth and spectacle that had defined her second marriage in favor of a quieter, more purposeful life built around work she genuinely found meaningful, ultimately living nearly 2 decades longer than Tina had. Where Tina's story remained tethered almost entirely to the shipping world she was born into, Jacqueline found a way to step outside the identity that fame and marriage had built around her, carving out a career and a life that, by the time of her own death, felt entirely and recognizably her own, rather than simply an extension of the powerful men she had once been married to. Both women, in their own strikingly different ways, carried the weight of having been married to one of the most powerful and complicated men of the 20th century, a man whose extraordinary business success seemed to exist in constant tension with the accumulating personal tragedies that surrounded nearly everyone closest to him. Tina's story ended in mystery and heartbreak, forever intertwined with the very same shipping dynasty rivalries that had shaped her entire life from the moment she was born. Jacqueline's story, while it began under circumstances every bit as scrutinized and complicated, ultimately found a kind of quiet resolution that Tina's tragically short life never had the chance to reach. It's a striking reminder that even two women who shared the same husband, the same extraordinary wealth, and much of the same relentless public attention could end up living and ending such profoundly different lives. Decades later, people remain fascinated by both women, not simply because of their connection to one of the wealthiest men who ever lived, but because their individual stories, so different from each other in how they ultimately unfolded, together capture something universally human about resilience, loss, and the search for identity beyond the shadow of extraordinary wealth and fame. Documentaries, biographies, and retrospectives continue to revisit their lives decades later, each new generation of readers and viewers discovering these two women's stories for the first time and finding, often to their surprise, just how much genuine hardship and heartbreak sat behind the glamorous headlines that once surrounded them both. Whatever else people remember about Aristotle Onassis, the shipping empire, the private island, the yacht, the headlines, it's often the stories of the two women who shared his life and who each found their own way of surviving it that continue to draw people back to this story again and again. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.